Think about the most awkward conversation you've ever had. Maybe the talk someone tried to give you when you were 12. Excruciating for everyone involved. Historically bad. Nobody made eye contact. Now imagine that conversation never happening. Not for your parents, not for their parents, not for anyone, for hundreds of thousands of years, because nobody had any idea there was anything to explain. Here is a fact that sounds completely impossible, but is almost certainly true. For most of human history, humans had no idea that sex caused pregnancy. Not kind of, not vaguely, no idea at all. And that single missing piece of information may have shaped every major institution of human civilization more than... So let's talk about it. Before you say, that's insane, how could they possibly not know? Stop and think about this from the beginning. You are a human being 50,000 years ago. You have excellent sensory capabilities. You're intelligent, observant, socially sophisticated, and you have exactly zero access to any information about how reproduction actually works at a biological level. You experience things, you connect causes to effects, but the causes you connect are the ones that happen close together in time. You eat something bad, your stomach hurts. Immediately. You touch fire, you get burned. Immediately. You step wrong, you fall. Immediately. 9 months is an eternity. It is an almost incomprehensibly long delay between a cause and its effect. By the standards of every other piece of cause and effect reasoning you've ever had to do in your entire prehistoric life. So you'd be connecting sex to pregnancy with the same logic that might connect sneezing to rain, or eating during a full moon to giving birth. The gap is too long. The connection is invisible. And there were other things happening in the meantime that seemed like much more plausible explanations. And here is where the story gets genuinely beautifully strange. In 1910, an anthropologist named Bronisław Malinowski arrived at the Trobriand Islands off the coast of Papua New Guinea, and he discovered something that changed how anthropologists thought about human cognition forever. The Trobriand Islanders, a sophisticated, complex, fully functioning society, did not believe that sex caused pregnancy, not as a religious metaphor, not as a poetic tradition, as a factual matter. They simply did not make the connection. They believed pregnancy was caused by a spirit entering a woman's body, an ancestral spirit, which entered while the woman was swimming. Sex, in their framework, was not connected to reproduction at all. Sex was for pleasure. Sex was social. Sex was just a thing people did. Like eating, but more fun. And when Malinowski, presumably suppressing every possible emotion simultaneously, tried to explain the biological reality, the Trobriand Islanders were not convinced, because from their perspective, the evidence for the spirit theory was overwhelming. Women got pregnant. Women also swam. Case closed. What was this European going on about? Now here is the part that actually matters. The Trobriand Islands in 1910 were not populated by prehistoric people. They were modern humans, cognitively identical to you, living in a functioning society with trade and politics and art and social hierarchy, and they had developed an entirely reasonable alternative explanation for something that, without biological knowledge, is genuinely not obvious, which means the same thing was almost certainly true of your ancestors for a very long time. And the Trobriand Islanders were not alone. Multiple traditional societies studied in the 19th and early 20th centuries reached similar conclusions through different routes. Some believed food caused pregnancy. Eat a certain fruit, a certain animal at a certain time, and a child might result. Actually not a terrible hypothesis if you've never heard of sperm. Women eat, women get pregnant. Cause, effect. Some believed wind was responsible. Some believed spirits. Some believed the moon. The moon theory was actually extraordinarily compelling given that menstruation follows a roughly lunar cycle. If you've noticed your body follows the moon and you have never heard of ovulation, the moon makes women pregnant is not a stupid conclusion. It is an observation-based hypothesis. It just happens to be wrong. And here's what's remarkable. It's not that ancient humans had the wrong answer. It's that the question was genuinely, legitimately, almost impossibly hard to answer correctly without information they had no way of accessing. The 9-month delay was the problem. It was simply too long. Human cognition was never designed to connect two events separated by 9 months with no observable mechanism in between. So what did prehistoric sex actually look like as a social experience? If nobody understood what it was biologically for? Probably a lot more relaxed, honestly. If there's no understood connection between sex and consequences, no paternity, no inheritance, no my child versus your child, then a lot of the social machinery we have built around sex doesn't need to exist yet. No need to control who anyone sleeps with if it has no implications for who the father is. No paternity certainty means no paternity anxiety, means no jealousy of the specifically reproductive and territorial kind. Our closest living relatives give us a useful baseline here. Female chimpanzees mate with multiple males. Bonobos use sex for social bonding constantly and apparently casually. Neither species shows any behavioral sign of understanding that sex produces offspring, and both are cognitively capable enough that they would figure this out if the connection were obvious. It isn't. For most of the time humans have existed, sex was probably more like bonobos than like a Victorian novel, which is either liberating or deeply uncomfortable to think about, depending on who you are and when you're watching this. Around 10,000 years ago, something happened that may have been the single most consequential intellectual development in human history. We started farming, and farming means something very specific in the context of this conversation. Farming means keeping animals, and keeping animals means watching them for months, watching them mate, and then watching them give birth. Goats, pigs, sheep, cattle. You keep these animals, you breed them, you observe the full cycle. You start noticing patterns, you start noticing correlations, and at some point in some village watching some goats, someone made the connection, and everything changed immediately, irreversibly, because now the question of who the father of any child was had become the most important social question in the world. Property, inheritance, land, animals. Whose children are whose? For the first time in human history, a man could look at a child and ask, "Is that mine?" And the answer, without other methods of control, was impossible to know with certainty. And that uncertainty, that specific, precise, newly discovered uncertainty, was not well tolerated. Here is the part of the story nobody talks about enough. The moment men understood paternity, or rather the moment they understood they couldn't be certain of paternity, is the moment the social control of women begins. Across cultures, across continents, independently, repeatedly, with remarkable and uncomfortable consistency. Virginity as a social value, paternity insurance. Marriage as an institution controlling sexual access, paternity insurance. Veiling, seclusion, chaperones, restricted movement, paternity insurance. The obsession of essentially every ancient legal code with female sexual behavior specifically, you already know the answer to that one. The Romans had it, the Greeks had it, ancient Mesopotamian law had it, ancient Chinese law had it, ancient Indian law had it. On every continent, in every early civilization, the same structure. Agricultural surplus creates inheritance. Inheritance requires paternity certainty. Paternity certainty requires controlling female reproduction, and that requirement produces every social institution you have ever been told was just natural or just traditional, none of which existed or needed to exist when nobody understood what sex was biologically for. So here is where we land. The concept of paternity, of my child, of the biological family unit as a legal and social structure. All of it rests on a single cognitive leap that humans didn't make for most of their existence. The 9-month delay was too long. The connection was invisible, and in the absence of that connection, sex was just sex. Pleasurable and social and consequence-free in the way we now associate with bonobos. And honestly, a significantly more relaxed Tuesday afternoon. The moment that changed, everything else followed. Marriage, inheritance, property, law, the entire architecture of how humans organize themselves into families and nations and civilizations. All of it downstream of one realization made by some now forgotten group of early farmers watching their goats and slowly, finally understanding what the connection was. The next time someone tells you that any social arrangement around sex or family or marriage is just natural or how it's always been, you can tell them, for most of human history, nobody had the faintest idea. And in some ways, that's the most human fact there is.